Chapter 4, Part 7. Cultural Invasion. The theory of anti-dialogical action has one last fundamental characteristic, cultural invasion, which, like divisive tactics and manipulation, also serves the ends of conquest. In this phenomenon, the invaders penetrate the cultural context of another group. In disrespect of the latter's potentialities, they impose their own view of the world upon those they invade and inhibit the creativity of the invaded by curbing their expression. Whether urbane or harsh, cultural invasion is thus always an act of violence against the persons of the invaded culture who lose their originality or face the threat of losing it. In cultural invasion, as in all the modalities of anti-dialogical action, the invaders are the authors of and actors in the process. Those they invade are the objects. The invaders mold, those they invade are molded. The invaders choose, those they invade follow that choice, or are expected to follow it. The invaders act, those they invade have only the illusion of acting, through the action of the invaders. All domination involves invasion, at times physical and overt, at times camouflaged, with the invader assuming the role of a helping friend. In the last analysis, invasion is a form of economic and cultural domination. Invasion may be practiced by a metropolitan society upon a dependent society, or it may be implicit in the domination of one class over another within the same society. Cultural conquest leads to the cultural inauthenticity of those who are invaded. They begin to respond to the values, the standards, and the goals of the invaders. In their passion to dominate, to mold others to their patterns and their way of life, the invaders desire to know how those they have invaded apprehend reality, but only so they can dominate the latter more effectively. In cultural invasion, it is essential that those who are invaded come to see their reality with the outlook of the invaders rather than their own. For the more they mimic the invaders, the more stable the position of the latter becomes. For cultural invasion to succeed, it is essential that those invaded become convinced of their intrinsic inferiority. Since everything has its opposite, if those who are invaded consider themselves inferior, they must necessarily recognize the superiority of the invaders. The values of the latter thereby become the pattern for the former. The more invasion is accentuated, and those invaded are alienated from the spirit of their own culture and from themselves, the more the latter want to be like the invaders, to walk like them, dress like them, talk like them. The social I of the invaded person, like every social I, is formed in the socio-cultural relations of the social structure, and therefore reflects the duality of the invaded culture. This duality, which was described earlier, explains why invaded and dominated individuals at a certain moment of their existential experience almost adhere to the oppressor thou. The oppressed I must break with this near adhesion to the oppressor thou, drawing away from the latter in order to see him more objectively, at which point she critically recognizes herself to be in contradiction with the oppressor. In so doing, he considers as a dehumanizing reality the structure in which he is being oppressed. This qualitative change in the perception of the world can only be achieved in the praxis. Cultural invasion is on the one hand an instrument of domination, and on the other the result of domination. Thus, cultural action of a dominating character, like other forms of anti-dialogical action, in addition to being deliberate and planned, is in another sense simply a product of oppressive reality. For example, a rigid and oppressive social structure necessarily influences the institutions of child-rearing and education within that structure. These institutions pattern their action after the style of the structure, and transmit the myths of the latter. Homes and schools, from nurseries to universities, exist not in the abstract, but in time and space. Within the structures of domination, they function largely as agencies which prepare the invaders of the future. The parent-child relationship in the home usually reflects the objective cultural conditions of the surrounding social structure. If the conditions which penetrate the home are authoritarian, rigid, and dominating, the home will increase the climate of oppression. As these authoritarian relations between parents and children intensify, children in their infancy increasingly internalize the paternal authority. Presenting with his customary clarity the problem of necrophilia and biophilia, Fromm analyzes the objective conditions which generate each condition, whether in the home, parent-child relations in a climate of indifference and oppression, or of love and freedom, or in a socio-cultural context. If children reared in an atmosphere of lovelessness and oppression, children whose potency has been frustrated, do not manage during their youth to take the path of authentic rebellion, they will either drift into total indifference, alienated from reality by the authorities and the myths the latter have used to shape them, or they may engage in forms of destructive action. The atmosphere of the home is prolonged in the school, where the students soon discover that, as in the home, in order to achieve some satisfaction, they must adapt to the precepts which have been set from above. One of these precepts is not to think. Internalizing paternal authority through the rigid relationship structure emphasized by the school, these young people tend, when they become professionals, because of the very fear of freedom instilled by these relationships, to repeat the rigid patterns in which they were miseducated. This phenomenon, in addition to their class position, perhaps explains why so many professionals adhere to anti-dialogical action. Whatever the specialty that brings them into contact with the people, they are almost unshakably convinced that it is their mission to give the latter their knowledge and techniques. They see themselves as promoters of the people. Their programs of action, which might have been prescribed by any good theorist of oppressive action, include their own objectives, their own convictions, and their own preoccupations. They do not listen to the people, but instead plan to teach them how to cast off the laziness which creates underdevelopment. To these professionals, it seems absurd to consider the necessity of rejecting the view of the world held by the people. The professionals are the ones with a world view. They regard as equally absurd the affirmation that one must necessarily consult the people when organizing the program content of educational action. They feel that the ignorance of the people is so complete that they are unfit for anything except to receive the teachings of the professionals. When, however, at a certain point of their existential experience, those who have been invaded begin in one way or another to reject this invasion, to which they might earlier have adapted, the professionals, in order to justify their failure, say that the members of the invaded group are inferior, because they are ingrates, shiftless, diseased, or of mixed blood. Well-intentioned professionals, those who use invasion not as deliberate ideology, but as the expression of their own upbringing, eventually discover that certain of their educational failures must be ascribed not to the intrinsic inferiority of the simple men of the people, but to the violence of their own act of invasion. Those who make this discovery face a difficult alternative. They feel the need to renounce invasion, but patterns of domination are so entrenched within them that this renunciation would become a threat to their own identities. To renounce invasion would mean ending their dual status as dominated and dominators. It would mean abandoning all the myths which nourish invasion, and starting to incarnate dialogical action. For this very reason, it would mean to cease being over or inside, as foreigners, in order to be with as comrades. And so the fear of freedom takes hold of these men. During this traumatic process, they naturally tend to rationalize their fear with a series of evasions. End of chapter 4, part 7.